Hello, I'm Sumit, and you're watching or listening to the Net Hero podcast. This is a podcast for you if you care about what we're doing to the planet. You don't have to be an eco-warrior. We believe business is the solution to making things better. But we're for people who want to make that difference by either cutting their emissions or coming up with ideas that can help us do things a bit better. We've featured politicians, academics, lots and lots of business people, entrepreneurs, inventors, and of course people who are just interested in doing the right thing. So sit back, listen and enjoy, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Please share it with your friends and colleagues, and you can always check out our two websites that cover all of this, Energy Live News and futurenetzero.com. This podcast is purely editorial, so sit back and enjoy this week's episode. The oceans, they are pretty much the reason we live. In fact, they're the reason for life on Earth. You look back at the history of the Earth, without the oceans, there is no life. And it's probably something that we just really take for granted. You think about it when you think about, the plastic kind of dump that's out there in the Pacific. You might think about it when you think about overfishing. You might even think about it perhaps when you see the old documentary, everyone remembers the David Attenborough one with the plastic straw up the turtle's nose, and it suddenly brought this whole thing about banning plastics. It can create that. But the oceans are actually probably the greatest engine for regulating our climate. And that's probably something we don't think about enough. When we talk about kind of climate change, it's not normal for us to think about ourselves sitting on land, the air we breathe, the rivers, the trees, stuff. We don't really think about what's going on in terms of damaging the ocean. Is that something we should be paying much more attention to? Well, you've probably seen the film Ocean or heard about it from David Attenborough, which explores exactly that. And I'm delighted to say that I'm speaking to part of the brains behind it all. I think that's the way to put it. Dr Jean-Luc Solandt. I hope I've got the pronunciation right, Jean-Luc Solandt. Is that right?
Solandt.
Solandt. And you're from the Blue Marine Foundation.
Yep.
And you sort of advise the film, and I'll go into a little bit about that in a moment. But in terms of what you do, some may have remembered an old podcast I did with your CEO, Claire, who's a really lovely person we've spoken to before. But what exactly does the Blue Marine Foundation do? And are you an international organisation or a British one?
Yeah, we're international. We've been around 15 years, and we have three pillars to our work. One is to protect what we've got. So that's really creating marine protected areas that are viable and effectual at restoring the damage done to the ocean. The second is probably where we came from originally, which is overfishing, which is slightly separate from the habitat damage associated with some of the uses of the sea, which fishing is probably the greatest damage to the sea collaterally, and catching the fish, we damage it, hence action one. But action two is simply what the public will know about, which is overfishing, which is perpetual, continuous, probably increasing in its intensity, and lack of proper controls and enforcement and regulation. And then the third is to restore the oceans. So where there are opportunities to actively restore the oceans, Blue Marine is involved in that, particularly in two projects that I know of. One in the Solandt, where we've been active for a long time in restoring salt marsh, seagrass and oyster reefs, but also further offshore, places like the Dogger Bank, which is you hear about on the weather forecast, on the shipping forecast. Well, it's actually a bank in the middle of the southern North Sea, which has historically been fished. And that's been degraded, but the UK government protected it in its entirety. It's about the size of Wales. They protected it in 2022 when we actually left the European Union. So restoration is something we like to think about doing as well. But restoration doesn't necessarily have to be active. It can be passive. The oceans, much like many ecosystems, can restore themselves. Trees grow, so do corals. It's not a great thing for people to actually think about moving sideways. Yeah. And the cheapest and most effectual way to restore large tracts of the ocean is just leave it alone. And that concept isn't really understood by particularly fishermen and the fishing industry. that likes to be free to be active everywhere, because there is always the opportunity to explore new areas, invest in different equipment that might require in the future to go to different areas, and to speculate, much like many business people do. But the problem with the way they speculate is they cause irreparable damage to the capital, to the stock, which Michael Gove got actually as the Secretary of State for Environment in about 2019. He started being advised by a guy called Dieter Helm at University of Cambridge, who provided him really good intellectual understanding and actual understanding of capital investment and capital stock of natural assets, and making sure that we passed on to the next generation our capital assets in at least the same state as they were when those people were born. And that is not the case. That is palpably not the case. We keep bearing down on our capital base. So restoration is required through biodiversity protection and active restoration. And overfishing is a big part of it. So they all sort of segue into each other, all of those three strands of our work.
You look at the ocean, and I suppose what I said at the beginning probably holds true to most of us. We think of it as overfishing, right? And we think of it as pollution, the plastic seas. We don't really think about it as a climate regulator. So can we just drop into the climate science? What does the ocean do in terms of balancing the way we live on Earth?
That's really good. I'm glad you brought that up. The oceans absorb something like 25% of the carbon that we produce every year.
Wow.
Sadly and unfortunately, their buffering effect is reducing in its ability, because the amount of carbon dioxide gets turned into carbonate ions, and those get turned into, they're slightly acidic, and that causes ocean acidification. It causes heating. The oceans at the moment around the British Isles, particularly in the southwest, are 2 to 4 degrees above normal at the moment. That might be related to our exceptionally warm weather that we're having this spring, because the oceans regulate our temperature in an active daily sense. How hot the oceans are is how hot the adjacent land is, because they regulate that. That's why we've always had a mild temperature relative to Canada at the same latitude, for example, because of the Gulf Stream. But not only that, and more pertinent to your question over geological timescales, the bottom of the ocean and the greatest biome, that means living area, of this planet is deep seabed. That means seabed below 1,000 meters. And that seabed doesn't really get any light. But what it does do, it accumulates all of the matter that is within the ocean, be it dead, be it carbon production and ejection through things like defecation. So the poo from fish, the poo from whales, and the organisms that, the greatest living biomass of organisms that migrates every day is plankton. Plankton is defined by those organisms that can't fight against the current. So it's all these tiny organisms, single cellular up to multicellular, like some krill shrimp are actually plankton, so are jellyfish. Now those die and they sink to the ocean floor. What does the ocean floor do? It absorbs that matter, it turns it over, and it stores it. The ocean depths at that depth are extraordinarily stable environments. That means that sediment, that organic matter is trapped in effect. Now it's trapped until such time as it is disturbed. Now it can be disturbed obviously by things like tsunamis and mid-ocean trench earthquakes, natural processes, but it can also be disturbed by bottom trawling. That's where these weighted nets are dragged along the sea floor, and those disturb that sediment. It reflocculates, and the organic particles in that sediment can either be absorbed by living matter at the base of the ocean, or they can be reflocculated into the ocean and at some time in the future turn into carbon dioxide. So there's a huge concern that we're understanding, which is probably akin to our concerns 20 to 30 years ago about rainforest destruction in the Amazon. What we've done to the oceans on a daily basis. This Oceans film describes the effect of bottom trawling better than I ever have in 25 years of dealing with this issue.
Yeah, we saw the clip, we put it out. It's an incredibly powerful bit of imagery of what it does.
That's right.
The point you're talking about there, I never thought about it, right? You think about, people have heard of algae, right? People have heard of plankton, but then think about all the dead bits floating down. And you say it gets locked. What happens? Does it get absorbed into the ground in the bottom of the sea, or what happens to that material?
Much like on land and soils, there'll be biological processes, there'll be bacteria and so forth that turn that material over and turn it from large matter into its constituent element. And of course, over geologic, over really long time, because it's lower down in the ocean column, there's lower oxygen levels, meaning those processes are slower. Nevertheless, they are there, and water is colder. Those two things together make the carbon cycle, the process of which carbon is returned into different matter or inorganic versions of carbon over time. It takes a lot longer. Nevertheless, it does happen, and it happens on the scale at which the planet looks like what it does now. I mean, you'll know that the Pangea that occurred, sorry, I don't know about timescales, but we're talking millions upon millions of years ago, before continental drift happened. We had, there would have been a change in the ocean basins at that time, but that process, we can't get in our heads as these stupid species that only live 100 years on this planet, how slow that is. So it does still allow, even though these continents are moving, that you see in some time scale great animation done to describe for students what the world looks like today. But that still would have been so slow that those processes would have been allowed to occur without carbon being released in vast quantities, other than what I've just described, which is the natural geological tectonic activity of our planet. So allowing organisms to live their lives, like, for example, whales are known to absorb 22 tons of carbon dioxide and transport it to the ocean floor when they die. So a dead whale on the ocean floor is taking all of that carbon of its life cycle and putting it in the ocean bed, and that's 22 tons of carbon straight away. Not regardless of what it's absorbed in its lifetime. And then the poo that they produce is absolutely vital for the plankton cycle, which then in the middle of the ocean, if you think of the middle of the ocean, it's a desert. It's got no nutrients in it. It's so far away from land. None of that leaf matter that is broken down and muds can go from rivers to the middle of the Indian Ocean. But the whales go there.
It's incredible, really. You don't even think about this, do you? Because we are it's natural. We see, people have been to the Amazon even, right? Yeah. You can fly over it, you can read it in books, you can see it in movies. Some people go there on a holiday. You can relate to it, right? My son just recently took a trip to the early part of the Amazon in Suriname, and he said, wow, it's incredible. It's like Jurassic Park, right? And it's incredible stuff. And we can see when they burn, we can see the wildfires, we can relate to it. And people want to protect trees. Naturally, we always want to protect trees, which is right. There's so much fuss about biomass boilers and things like that. But we don't have that connection with the ocean, do we? In terms of what you just said. We've got the connection with it. We like to go for a dip in it and, we sail some boats or something and, fishing. But we don't think about it as the way we think about the land. And is that why, do you think we've sort of, how can I put it? We've just used it and abused it for centuries, really.
Well, much like anything. I do a talk where I talk about my past. I have ancestors who, 2 generations ago, my grandfather was harbour master in Falmouth in southwest England, and his first entry in his log was to load a ship with gunpowder bound for the Southern Ocean to destroy whales. So that gunpowder was used for the harpoon guns. So 2 generations later, his grandson's doing the exact opposite and trying to save the whales. Now, more of the public, they're somewhere between the two of us, right? So we don't like killing sentient, large, long-lived mammals. Yeah. Although we'll kill cows on an industrial level to eat their meat, I suppose. But that's a question for another podcast. But the point being, I'm trying to make the point that we have a mercantile past, we have an industrial past. Yes. We have lived off the land, and our ancestors, 500 to 1,000 years ago, would be much more understanding of the ecological processes that allowed them to make a living off the environment. Natural processes, they use natural materials. We are, in our society, removed from the impact of our consumptive power and its effect on the environment, be that at sea, probably more so than on land. On land, one would understand the taking of that rainforest to turn them into pastures, short-term cattle farming, right? We can think about that and understand that, but we haven't understood the effect of the industrialization of the fishing industry that has, if you look at a trawling footprint map of the British Isles, there's almost not a red dot that's free, a bit of a unit of space that's free from such activity in the British Isles continental shelf.
Yeah, which is really staggering, which, you said that the bottom is like a carbon sink, just like those forests. And yet we've been degrading them with these bottom trawling. And I never even put the two together until you just mentioned it. I've heard of bottom trawling. I know it's bad because I think of all the bycatch, the other species that die in it. But you don't think about it affecting carbon. You don't think about it disturbing, the way the planet's temperature and global weather systems work. And that's a really big disconnect.
Yeah, to a degree, that's understandable because the science that's starting to show that pattern is really new. It's still being
Right.
It's still being debated, actually. But there's also these living things that live on the seabed, much like there are forests on the floor. Obviously, when we go into a forest, we'll try and catch a bird or maybe a mammal to eat. We won't necessarily destroy the forest to do that. Now, it would some of the imagery I've seen and some of the understanding I have of the seabed, it did contain forest-like organisms. Generally, they didn't grow to the extent of size that you get in terrestrial forests. Nevertheless, they were as important in their biomass, but also they do these things that Michael Gove got, again, talking of natural capital. They did services for mankind. So they filtered the seawater. So it wasn't just about storing carbon. So sponges, you think of sponges? If you put a sponge in a room, if the equivalent of the volume of this small bedroom in a typical 4-bedroom house, it would sort of a small sponge about the size of a vase would absorb all the matter in this room in about 2 days.
That's incredible. You don't think about that.
So they clean the water, and so do filter feeding organisms like oysters and mussels. Now the problem is you can't really blame people because we did the activity that caused the damage to these things before we started being sentient towards it or conscious of it, because science took time to catch up. We started to look at fossil beds, but so now we're in this period of trying to pull back. And I've got a very interesting man I spoke to recently in the Channelizer who said it's a bit like the smoking denial phase, but of course that's a personal choice rather than a societal impact. Well, it was a bit as well, but so smoking for about 10 years was denied as to be a problem, and then politicians got it. Now we've got to do the same with seabed trawling. We've got to get rid of it from the marine protected areas as much as possible. There are marine protected areas that are designed for the seabed, and they're still not being protected from it. I understand if there are there are protected areas for seabirds or something swimming in the water column, then there has to be a different debate. And we have a number of those in the UK, but we're still not protecting our seabed marine protected areas from this. And it's not just about the carbon. That's what I'm just saying. Basically, it's about the biodiversity. The biodiversity is really important for fish habitat. It's really important for water filtration. It's really important for divers and tourists to be interested. It's really important for all sorts of processes that are not valued, but they should be because they're free.
Yeah,
we don't quantify that. They are free.
If we look at it, the way people have fished traditionally has actually been very sustainable, right?
Well, probably up to about 150 years ago.
Yeah. So that for the vast majority of human time on this planet, we've done things all right. All right, we've gone out
at sea, mostly.
And then we've suddenly had this technological change last 100-odd years, as you say.
Industrial revolution.
Does that mean that this is the real quandary that we have? Because some people say, just stop eating fish, right? Stop eating sea animals or oysters, whatever. People's economies around the world develop on it. People like eating it. I don't mind eating it myself. Nor
do I.
So you feel like that you can't sort of say no to that, and it's the denial thing that's very hard to get humans to do. So then the other point is, why is it if we have already marine protected zones, what do you call them? The name for it?
Protected areas. You can call them marine protected zones. We get the message, don't we?
Yeah. So why on earth are we still doing these trawling activities? Why are we not going to lines and hooks like we did so we don't get bycatch? Why are these not mandatory? Is it simply because we are just, politically, we're just all so divided? Or is it just the economic argument? You just can't catch enough for the demands of our bellies?
The economic argument doesn't work because we subsidise the fishing fleet. We pay the tax on the fuel. So it's definitely economically invalid as a fishery.
Right. Okay.
So the fact that that's still happening as marine protected areas is a travesty, I would suggest, because the public are paying for something to happen in a marine protected area that's damaging the marine protected area. It's meant to be there for the public's benefit, which is just terrible. So that's the first thing. So it's economically unviable. It's become economically unviable and subsidized to that extent because people feel sorry for the industry, and it has to fish harder to catch the same amount of fish. Further afield, we buy fishing rights in distant water states. So we have fishing rights off West Africa through the European Union. Well, the European Union does. I don't think British vessels do. But the EU did buy fishing rights exploited by French and Spanish flagged vessels. So we're fishing African waters. they're meant to be up to 12 nautical miles, but they definitely encroach all the time. The Indian Ocean tuna fleet puts out these fish aggregating devices, these devices which attract the tuna underneath it. They leave them in the ocean, they drift, they've got a satellite transponder on them, and they can go and get them after about a week and fish all the tuna out. Those fish aggregating devices might float inside a banned zone and outside. Is that regulated? Does society want to pay for an observer to be on that vessel? Does an observer want to get the grief from the fishing persons on the vessel whose livelihood it is? It's a stressful job. We also, through the nature of our cultural association with fishing as being really important to feeding us, I think, particularly after World War II, where there were privations and the common agricultural policy still has this hangover with massive SOPs and subsidies to exhaustive and straining for the ecosystem farming techniques. Exactly the same happens on the ocean. I mentioned the fuel subsidy. There are gear subsidies. There's onshore facility subsidies, employment for subsidies, because of the politicization of fishing. And why is fishing so politicized? Because it's about turf wars. What we've seen in the last trade and cooperation agreement, bun fight, is fishing stopping defense over the potential to lose our democracy over a war with Russia. It's utterly mad how powerful the fishing lobby has been to affect debates of reasonable use of the sea, so that it can maintain its access to our waters, for example, which are the richest in Northern Europe for sure. That's why people really care from Europe about maintaining access to our waters, because historically, way even before the Industrial Revolution, Spanish, French, and Belgian boats were probably coming over here and exploiting our
cod.
Yes.
I remember as a kid. Yeah, the cod wars with Iceland. I remember that.
Absolutely. And we went to Iceland and they came over here. And if you go to some of the great fishing museums of Northern Europe, I was lucky to be in Northern France, in Normandy on holiday last year. And those boats historically went over to the Grand Banks in America, way before they were using engine power. So in the 1800s, when they were really good at shipbuilding, but they didn't have engine power, they take these enormous vessels over with about 12 dinghies that would row out and do lots and lots of long lines. Now, the reason long lining doesn't occur now and won't be able to replace trawling is because we have to trawl for about 4 hours to catch the amount of fish that long lining would do in about a year.
Wow.
That's how low the biomass of fish is. There's a paper that came out, I always use it, from 2010, that says we have lost 95% of the biomass. That means the weight of the typical species like halibut, cod, haddock, ling, megrim, sole from the North Sea since industrial fishing existed. 95%. That means you have to fish in real terms 95% harder in terms of the power of the vessel and so forth. So that's where we are. We are in this. So when you see you hear in the news, cod's gone up in biomass or something like that, let's let them catch a bit more cod. We've probably gone up by about 5% from 95% to 90%. And this is the sad state of our lack of understanding, going back to that mercantile lack of understanding of our environmental limits, something called shifting baselines, whereas, each generation doesn't understand the earth as it was the generation before. It gets worse and worse. Yeah, all those are factored into this. But the critical thing goes back to that natural capital element. I really respected that narrative of describing this. We've just reduced the capital to a paltry remnant of what it was in the past. And protected areas I will fight for the rest of my life, because they're the things, and when they work, let's be optimistic. We've got demonstrations of how they work and where they work. They're fantastic. And they don't have to be everywhere. We're just calling for 30% of them, just like global countries around the world called for at the Kunming-Montreal Treaty in 2023. We're just calling for the countries of the world to do what they said they'd do and give everybody a better resource base. And that includes fishing industry. So that's why at Blue Marine Foundation, we're unforgiving in our narrative over this. We think it's good for everybody, including fishers, in the long run. And we've seen that in the small protected areas that are really well managed.
We look at this and if someone's watching this or listening to this, you run a business, right? And there's loads of big retailers who listen and watch this podcast. I go to my shop and it says responsibly fished or sourced, all of that stuff, when you go and buy your fish. Do we trust that? I don't know. I assume they're trying to do the right things. Then you go back to what you've just said about how much biomass we've lost. And then you look at how our populations are growing, and it does seem to doom and gloom. So, two questions. One, why are we not protecting these zones? Is it just if they've been set and governments have agreed to it, is it just because they're turning a blind eye? They don't have enough resources. And two, there's a hell of a lot more of us than there were even when I was born nearly 60 years ago. So our demand for these resources is only going to increase. So how do we manage that? So let's take those two things. One, is it just a lack of enforcement? And two, what are we going to do about growing populations?
Yeah, I think the first one, blind eye, I completely agree with, because we have the regulations to do this. So they're just not enforcing them. A bit like the Environment Agency for our rivers, for example. It's not too different at sea. So we, flood protection, we've only got so much money. So the second thing is resources. Yes. How much money do you need to effectively prosecute a boat that's fishing in a marine protected area? Well, actually, you just need, there are already satellite transponders on those vessels. If you turn them off, you should be in port, or you shouldn't be in that area. So you can prosecute using transponders. In fact, the Marine Management Organization did prosecute a French boat recently for doing such a thing, when it was just being bloody minded when we initially designated an area as a no fishing zone. So resources and taking people to trial is really important, and not having a blind eye, being outraged that this is happening. We've got to change that narrative. How do you change that narrative? I think public action and public will. So when the oceans become something that is something that the voting public care about. So do we need a minister for the oceans? Yes, we do, because it's an enormous resource the world over, and I think we do in the UK. So that's the first thing. What was the second point again?
The second point is that more people, more demand, more eating of fish.
More pressure. Yeah, so the way you deal with it at the moment is to fish harder, and we have been doing that. We've been doing that since probably the 70s and 80s. I would suggest. We also fish down the food chain. And so we've run out of fish. So what we can still eat is scallops or catch for our profit. So instead of the fishing industry providing food for the nation, now it just provides its good return on something we don't eat, which is scallops. And I don't know if the world lives on scallops. We did live on the biomass.
They're only in posh restaurants. The only time I've ever had them, Sherling, is in posh restaurants. That's the only time you ever get them.
You see, you'll hear the narrative from the fishing industry that we're about food security. So stopping us is stopping the food security for nations where I just mentioned the 95% biomass thing, didn't I? I mean, they don't add up. We could have so much more food if we left areas alone. The population's getting bigger. The management is still stupid. I just want to be blunt because I'm 55. So I can't use clever words anymore. But we're just not applying. We're not applying the management. It is potentially there. We're not doing a bad job in certain places. It's complex. We're trying to maintain a dying industry in many areas. Inshore, it's tragic. We have lost 30% of our fishing fleet since 2005. I think that's the small guys inshore. They haven't been able to fish at all. They're on their knees. They're suffering from the big boats offshore coming close and getting bigger gear. Still vast volumes and sizes of nets and equipment that are able to fish right up to the 6 mile limit, which the fishermen thought they'd get with Brexit, and they had the wall pulled over their eyes. So is this a matter of global population growth, or just stupidity and turning a blind eye and protectionism? I think it's the latter. I think we do have the ability through protecting 30% of our seas of recovering a real big biomass of these organisms, despite what happens in the other 70%.
Is it a global problem?
Yes. It's probably worse in Europe than it is in the UK, since so it's definitely worse.
In the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, no matter where you go, wherever we are, we're doing the same thing.
Yeah, we're doing the same thing. It's particularly sour tuna, because tuna is extraordinarily renewable resource. It's pelagic, and Europe is hugely guilty in doing that, in buying but buying the rights to fish, and of course it can do what it wants in the EEZ, but there are commissions out there to try and stop and limit that catch, but they're probably not completely free of some pressure, be that financial or other means, from European boats to exploit those offshore areas outside of the EEZs of nations. So that's definitely taking place in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean to the unsustainable level of fish in those areas. Also, you have the problem of like global geopolitics affecting transoceanic fishery limits. For example, the Antarctic Ocean is meant to be managed by something called CAMLAR, and the C stands for conservation. I think it's the conservation of Antarctic marine living resources. That's what that stands for. And that every year meets in Hobart, and all the world's states are meant to agree limits on access to the oceans. Now, the land is protected, is it not? I think certain countries want to drill there, but it is protected. Now, the oceans are not, and the oceans contain the biomass of food for all of the penguins, all of the seals, all of the fish, and mostly all of the whales of the globe that migrate huge distances. I just described at the beginning of this podcast where the whales come from with all that stuff in their bellies and poo it all out in the tropical desert oceans. They get it from the Antarctic and the Arctic, where these productive oceans occur. Now, it's krill. Now, the krill fishery went up under the auspices of CAMLAR, this I cannot believe, from 130,000 tonnes to over 600,000 tonnes at the last meeting, mainly due to pressure from China and Russia, and also companies that are making millions from, and probably billions, from fish meal. Now, those protein pellets, which is what fish want in our fish farms. Your salmon you've eaten in Scotland might have derived its protein from drying and compressing. It all happens on factory ships. That's just demonstrated in the ocean film. It happens on factory ships in the Southern Ocean. An ocean which I think anyone would think would be protected, would be off limits. So we had whaling there up until the 1970s and 1980s. It had a bit of a breather. And now the very food that those animals that were meant to be protecting, and this wasn't covered in the ocean film, are being taken out to the degree 6 times of what the baseline of the sustainability. And there is only one marine protected area in that entire ocean. I don't know how much it covers. I don't know how well regulated it is. And it was a bun fight to get one protected area in the CAMLAR ocean realm. So
this is the most bloody depressing podcast I think I've done in the 2.5 years we've been doing this.
Sorry about that, but No,
it's brilliant. It's what people need to hear, because I think we just do not comprehend, because we disassociate with the sea. And I think, and you're right, we have these kind of, I have it, the romantic things of, fishermen and I've been out fishing when I was at the BBC. I went out off Lowestoft, and they were great guys. Off they were going, and you kind of have a, this country particularly, but all around the world, fishermen are what the first things we did, apart from becoming farmers. That's what we did. So we've got a real connection with it. But the oceans, from what you're saying,
there's a philosophical paradox. Is they're more connected to the ocean and their resource, and in some ways more honest and better people than any of us lot in the conservation sector. It's so hard to generalize, and one shouldn't ever. It's stupid to do so, and therein lies the disaster of society if you generalize all the time. So there are some, look, just to leave you on an optimistic note, I don't know how long this is going to go on for.
No, we got only about another 5 minutes, but
just briefly, just to finish my point, just to give you a bit of optimism, there are these excellent bodies. There are excellent bodies in England called Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities who broker these difficult situations because they're intelligent, they're at the right scale, about 100 kilometers of coast, they know their stakeholders, and they're balanced in their regulatory output. They're not necessarily healing the whole problem, but they're getting some way down the line of dealing with this societal problem and environmental problem. I just wanted to leave you with that.
No. The one thing I want to pick up on, which I think I haven't seen the film, but I've had the press pack, but I've read articles about this, is that, and you said it right at the beginning, if you leave the bloody ocean alone, it has an amazing power to recover.
Absolutely.
So before we go, please give me some optimism that if we could do this, if the businesses who are making the purchasing decisions who are watching this, we as consumers, if we start to make more of a fuss, can the oceans recover?
Absolutely. The facts I've seen from relatively small areas are lobsters increasing in size by 4. The large lobsters going up by 4 times the amount that they were before they were fished in small zones, about 2 square kilometers. Another site about that size saw scallop increases of 7 times the number of animals, 4 times the number of animals that would be breeding. I've seen other studies from Jersey, which we funded actually, that showed that juvenile fish, which are really important for anglers in the south coast of England, called black bream, are increased in numbers in protected areas. So that means they'll spill out when they grow up to areas outside that and provide better benefits to the angling industry. Again, small areas. I've seen much, much greater impact of that in the tropics. When I used to work in the tropics, of biomass of things like jacks, these big spectacular animals that actually can exist in relatively small no-take fishing zones. And the seabed improves the biodiversity on the seabed. The amount of sponges, the corals, they do increase. So I spent about 5-10 years of my career, after getting some protection measures in through some of the lobbying I did, really in a nice way doing some of the work in Falmouth where my grandfather had done what he'd done, and describing and showing through science how the seabed got richer. So there are these studies that, and we don't want to study everywhere because it would just cost too much money. So we just have to take these studies and use them as examples of what's going to happen here, there, and everywhere. We can't study 100,000 square kilometers. It will take billions of pounds to do it. So society and the fishing industry has to please just give us the time and give us 10 years. That's all, to prove this will work. And it'll work on the network scale. At the moment, it's just working in the smaller number of sites we've really protected.
People will be thinking, why the hell have I put you and this conversation on a podcast about kind of, net zero and sustainability? But I think you've just outlined, it's one of the most important factors in balancing our planet.
I think it's a scale. It's a scale that people don't. They understand the atmosphere is big. Like it goes up to about 200 kilometers, does it not? But we just shove stuff out there. But we got concerned about ozone, right? That was like the don't look up moment, wasn't it? Because we're all going to get sunburn. Shall we put it mildly? If we keep spraying these things, this is the same scale. This is like that habitat up there is in the sea, and we just look out and see a flat thing, and the importance of it and what it can do for us if we just get the life back to absorb the carbon, to secure the benthos, that means the seabed where this stuff settles. We will deal with a huge amount of these problems overnight, and it's the easiest one to do.
I think that's the best place to leave it. It's been brilliant, depressing and inspiring. So in both measures.
Well,
Jean-Luc,
it's Friday. It's Friday, everybody.
It's 5 o'clock. It's crackerjack.
Yeah.
We're the same generation. Thank you so much. Blue Marine Foundation. Check it out, everyone. They do brilliant work. Claire Brooke, who runs it, and people like Jean-Luc doing amazing work. And if you are inspired by this, get involved. There's petitions out there to write to ministers. There's stuff going on. We really ought to look at our oceans as a way of trying to help us in the battle for balancing the climate. Thank you for your time. Really
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Great to be on.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from FutureNetZero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. FutureNetZero.com. Better business, better planet.